Welcome to our second event in the CCR speaker series. Today we're featuring a talk from Dan Jones. As you can see, it's on trauma-informed policing, understanding the justice client for human-centered design. And Dan has worked in the justice system for 25 years. He spent 3 years as a correctional officer, 22 years as a police officer, rising to the rank of inspector with the Edmonton Police Service. He's earned his master's degree at University of Cambridge in applied criminology, receiving a Wakefield scholarship, and is currently a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Huddersfield, where he received the Secure Societies Institute Scholarship. And his focus is on victim-offender overlap and looking at how research and evidence-based practice can create positive systems of change. So I will turn it over to Dan, and I'm going to shut off my microphone and camera and let him take it away.
Super. Thanks very much. And first of all, thanks to you and thanks to the Center for Criminological Research at the University of Alberta for allowing me to do this presentation. And I would be remiss if I didn't say thank you to Professor Haggerty, Professor Basarius, and Professor Berardi for allowing me to come in and do research with them on the University of Alberta Prison Project and the topic of the victim-offender overlap. But before I get started, I just want to talk about two motivating factors for this research. And I think the motivating factors are important. They happened to me both when I was a police officer, and I'm going to just apologize in advance or just give a warning in advance that some of the things I'm going to talk about today are hard to hear, and there's going to be hard language, and I apologize in advance for that, but just be aware that that is part of this presentation because it's the voice of a lot of people who experienced a lot of trauma. But the primary motivating factor for this were two events in my policing career. One was an individual that I knew very well, ended up later in life, there was an individual by the name of Gordon Domney. Gordon Domney was charged for the sexual assault of numerous boys in a youth center in Edmonton that occurred in the 80s and didn't come to light till sometime in the early 2000s. During that investigation, 13 young men were interviewed and provided statements in relation to that. And one of those young men, who I'd known for a long time because he was actually incarcerated in the Edmonton Maximum Security Institution when I worked there, after his interview went home and committed suicide. Fast forward a few years or a year or so, when court started coming up, I was the inspector and I had victim services in my purview at the time. And I asked victim services to go see the 5 incarcerated men who were going to be giving testimony in relation to this topic. And I was told no, that we do not, the victim services at the time did not enter prisons, and they dealt with victims, not offenders. This research, eventually now we have victim services in incarcerated facilities in the Edmonton area, and I will say that this research that we were able to do committed that. The second incident was an incident that occurred very early on in my career, and it was I was walking a foot patrol on 118th Avenue and 88th Street, and I was walking through an alley. And as I walked through the alley, I walked past a pile of garbage, and I heard some noises coming from the garbage, and I went over to look. And what I found was a young woman who had been brutally sexually assaulted and thrown in the garbage. I spent the day with her. I still to this day actually have contact with her. Never solved the crime, never figured out who did it. She was a sex trade worker who was supporting herself through the means of selling sex. The thing that I want to bring up about this was 3 weeks later, I got a handwritten note in the mail from her mother, thanking me for treating her like a human, thanking me for treating her daughter like a human being. At first, I thought that was very sweet, and then I started to wonder, how many times have we not treated people like human beings? How many times have we ignored their trauma? And how many times have we looked at them in that single moment of time as a victim or an offender without having any thought or concern for the trauma or their life experiences beyond that moment? I was fortunate to go to school after, and then I was able to do this research, which is we're going to talk about today. The University of Alberta Prison Project conducted in-depth interviews with over 800 inmates and 200 staff inside of 4 provincial and 2 federal prisons in Western Canada between 2016 and 2020. Just an idea of the prison population, just so we know what we're talking about. In Canada, 40,000 total number of inmates, daily count, and federal and provincial. Federal system is a system where you get sentenced to 2 years plus a day or more than 2 years, up to life imprisonment. There's roughly 23,000 federal inmates, 3% of which are women. The provincial systems where you do less than 2 years, so 2 years less a day, they call it. And plus the remand is also there. Roughly 22,000 total individuals incarcerated, 13% of which are women, 10,000 sentenced, 12,000 remand, for a total of roughly 250,000 total annual admissions through the system. Just a quick reminder, just to turn your mics off because we're getting a little bit of feedback from somebody's microphone. So if you could do that, that'd be great. One thing that's important to note when you look at these numbers, and we're talking about trauma-informed policing, every single one of these people has dealt with a police officer, because the police are 100% in control of the intake into the criminal justice system. Dominant narratives: people need to be punished for the crimes they commit, and prisons are horrible institutions. They serve no purpose and do no good. Prisons are shit. And I'm going to talk about how somewhere in the middle is where we probably find ourselves. I'm going to talk about how we can change the experience of people as we go along by looking at things differently. One of the things I think we need to look at is the complicated findings and looking at individuals' lives and some of the nuances that we find when discussing things with people. Victimization. Over 95% of the men and 97% of women in the sample experience victimization in their lives. The second one I use as a very important statement: the 82% of men and 83% of women experience this first victimization prior to their detected offense. Because what's in the literature, it often talks about the victim offender overlap being as a result of lifestyle choice or lifestyle that people are in. We're talking about individuals who prior to their first detected offense have had this level of victimization. And we're going to talk about this in comparison with another bit of research later. And I think just want to bring your thoughts to look at this and remember those numbers. But let's look at some of the victimization stories that people tell. I'm a true believer in mixed methods. I'm a believer that numbers and statistics have a place. But numbers and statistics don't necessarily change the hearts and minds of people. Understanding the human experience, understanding what people have gone through, understanding what trauma is in a way that's real, I think is necessary, and it's necessary for change. And I'm going to read these quotes. They, family members, molested me, and my daughter is from incest. And then I used to get raped by other people and that would come to our house. And by the time I was 16, I was sold into sexual relationships with other people. An ex tried killing me, so I left him. When I told him we were never getting back together, he snapped and started strangling me and chased me with a fucking machete out of my house until the police came. I went to start dating him, kept going back because it was him or homeless. And I know how to be in an abusive relationship. I don't know how to be homeless. And I think what we've done from a justice perspective is we've looked at things almost always as a justice solution. What we fail to recognize is what we're dealing with on a very regular and common basis is trauma. And it also is the impact of complex trauma and multiple things going on in people's lives at one time that can't be solved with a justice solution. As we look at these stories and we look at what we're saying, we're talking about symptoms. We're talking about symptoms of trauma, symptoms of other issues. And when you look at policing as the solution or the cure for these symptoms, it's truly like giving an antacid tablet for pancreatic cancer. I lost who I was. And so being in here, like I didn't know jail, kind of saved me, because if I wasn't in jail right now, I would probably still be getting high and still be in that abusive relationship. I'm actually kind of glad I'm now in here right now. Yeah, a lot of them actually get worried and will start to cry when they have to leave. A lot of them don't want to leave, or they'll get physically into a fight before they leave so they can stay in and get charged again. The interviewer asks, are they scared to get out? The respondent, yeah. Interviewer, why are they scared? Probably going to like family on the outside or an abusive relationship, I'm guessing, or like getting out to nothing. A lot of them are worried about getting out to nothing because they're thinking, where will they go and what will they do? And it's cold outside. I think that's a pertinent conversation right now, or quote right now, as we look at a downturn in the weather. And we look at a downturn in the weather and we think of people being homeless or released from prison into homelessness and what that experience might be like. I also want to say that these were matter-of-fact stories. The victimization was presented as an inescapable part of their lives. Participants did not try to excuse their criminal behavior. They presented their victimization stories as matter-of-fact aspects. And most of them had the worldview, I did the crime, I'll do the time. Again, I'm going to bring your attention back to the 82 and 83% of these individuals who experienced victimization prior to their first detected offense. Somehow in their minds, they conflate the fact that they've committed crimes as a reason that they deserve the atrocities that occurred to them prior to their first detected offense. And that's an unfortunate mindset. And I think it's incumbent upon us, justice systems actors who interact with these folks every day, it's incumbent upon us to try to change that narrative. Talked about housing in that previous quote. 73% of the women and 43% of the men in our federal sample have been homeless at some point in their lives. This is a stark difference compared to the national average of people who experience homelessness. Like right now, I've lost everything. And all of a sudden I got evicted and I had no clothes. And then, so now I got no place and no clothes. Recently, I talked to a woman in the Edmonton Institution for Women, not part of the research, but part of my other job, who had been charged with murder in 1992. She'd been out of jail for 8 years. And she had a couple of drinks and went home with someone, and it turned out that that individual had a partner, a spouse, and it created an incident that required her calling the police. Police arrived, and unfortunately, she had conditions, no alcohol conditions, not to drink. In March, she was arrested for a breach of her parole conditions. She lost her job of 8 years, her home, and all her belongings. And she's sitting in the Edmonton Institution for Women right now with limited hope as to what the next steps are for her. Before I got arrested this last time, I wanted to come back to jail because I didn't have a house. I didn't have a shelter. I didn't know when I was going to eat. I didn't know where I was going to shower. When we look at drugs, 82% of all men and women in the sample report using drugs outside of prison, while 49% of all men and women report using drugs inside of prison, with women reporting at a higher rate and prevalence of both groups. We see drugs as a problem in society, and we don't realize that the drugs are oftentimes a symptom of trauma, a symptom of what we need to prevent from happening to us, or a symptom of how to forget what's happened to us. This is from one of the women in the sample. The percentage is probably about 90%. That's a generous 10% because I'm the only one I know that doesn't have a drug problem. Like, I've done drugs before, I'll probably do them again, but I've never had an addiction. And I think this is an important quote because I think people have to understand the reasoning behind things, that things are not, again, the single story. Like, sometimes we have to use pint, crystal meth, to stay up. You have to do the drugs to stay up because you fall asleep on the streets, you'll get raped. You know what I mean? The guys would take advantage of you or something. It's like a bit of relief coming to jail. This place saved my life. I would have been a junkie instead of showing up in shackles and handcuffs. I probably would have been in a body bag, you know. This is the only place that I actually do get clean. This is when it always ends for me. Like, this is the best case scenario for ending in jail. Like, if you can't say no in here, you're never going to say no out there. I've been doing heroin since I was 12 years old. I was so messed up with my mom passing away recently. I overdosed 4 times in 1 week. So I really think if I didn't come to jail when I did, I would have probably overdosed and died. I was doing like 4 grams a day before I came in here. It's time to change the conversation. We need to stop talking about criminalizing and over-criminalizing and marginalizing and over-marginalizing populations. It's not about crime, drugs, choices. It's about ACEs, trauma, and pain. We need to start changing by how we see the system actors interact. We need to start actually partnering police, public health, education, fire, emergency medical services, Alberta Health Services, and truly work to be trauma aware and trauma informed. I would suggest right now that the majority of our agencies that we work with and the majority of agencies that interact with justice clients aren't even trauma aware. It's unfortunate that oftentimes we hear words like trauma and we hear words like even community-based policing, for instance, and there's no true definition that we all agree upon in the justice system. We need to really stop, take a look back, and allow the individuals that we interact with on a daily basis to teach us about their lives. There are currently government strategies for opioids, methamphetamine, poverty, and homelessness. The data show that people fall into multiple categories. Rather than a strategy for the symptom, it's time for human-centered trauma-informed practice in the criminal justice system to start. And I say to start because all of us, I'm sure, are aware of recent incidents in hospitals and that individuals who were treated poorly because of their color of their skin. There has been comments and commentary around systemic racism and bias. There has been the denial of it, and then there's been the agreement that it exists. But what I haven't truly seen yet is a plan to move past it. We are fortunate in the city of Edmonton, I would suggest, to have Chief McPhee, because he actually has a plan working with the community, and we're going to see how that goes. We need to do better. We need to, as systems actors, understand what our impact can possibly be. We need to also bring the data and research into play, because that is helpful for us to understand the actual impacts that we can have, and sometimes how we can change our own behavior for better outcomes for the population that we work with. Now I'm going to talk about something that I call universal precautions for trauma. First aid teaches us universal precautions for blood and bodily fluid. And when you look at the Canadian statistics that show 0.6% of the population is Hep C positive, and 0.006% of the population is HIV positive. We teach people to wear personal protective equipment to prevent the spread of these of Hep C and HIV, along with other things. I just picked these two. We put the gloves on and we put our PPE on in a first aid situation to protect the individual who's injured from us and the individual who is helping from the injured and the blood. I'm going to bring your attention back again to the numbers that we discussed early on, with the 95% of men and 97% of women and 82% of men and 83% of women experiencing victimization. And that's only one form of trauma that we're talking about. We talked about homelessness. I haven't even, nor did I, but a large number of individuals in our sample experienced foster care. When we look at this concept of universal precautions for trauma, why have we not gone here yet? When I talk about this in policing circles or justice circles or with judges and lawyers, everyone goes, yeah, that makes total sense that this is how much trauma these individuals have experienced. Why have we gone for so long without taking this opportunity to turn our system less, and I'm speaking around policing specifically, less around public safety and more around the concept of community safety and well-being? More around the concept of, when we interact with people, understanding that they come from a place often with trauma, and we start with a word when we deal with individuals, regardless of if they're the victim offender or the offender or the victim or a combination therein. But we start with the word compassion. If you start with the word compassion, that's where trauma informed begins. In Sweden, they recently put out a graphic that talks about this, and at the very center of the trauma-informed practice that they're talking about in Sweden is the word compassion. We can never go wrong dealing with people in a compassionate sense. We can never go wrong assuming that people have had experiences that we don't know about when we're dealing with them in the moment. We can never go wrong from a policing perspective in making sure that we work as hard as we can to provide a positive experience in somebody's justice life. And that doesn't matter if they're getting arrested or they're the victim of a crime. I'm going to use an example when it comes to trauma-informed, and it's an example that I use often. It's in relation to a young lady named Sam Flavio. And I can say her name because it's her that got the ban lifted on her own sexual violence experience in Vancouver and victimization. What happened with Sam was she was at a high school dance, and she was a male followed her into the bathroom and forced sex upon her in a violent fashion. The first question the police asked was, what were you wearing? And the second question they asked was, how much did you have to drink? Making Sam feel like she was the problem, failing to think about the trauma that Sam had just undergone, and failing to think and failing to address how much this is going to impact her moving forward. When the judge rendered the decision, the judge found the individual guilty, but said he would be remiss to allow this person to miss his high school graduation because that was unfair and the young man had promised. That required Sam to not go to her high school graduation, knowing that there would be a traumatic experience of facing her predator at a high school dance. When we talk about trauma-informed training, it's about having those conversations with a trauma-informed lens and making sure that people's justice experiences are less salty than they would have been, and hopefully provide some sense of compassion to them so they feel dignity and they feel respected. The National Inquiry into Missing, Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls calls for justice for trauma-informed systems. If you read the document, the word trauma and trauma-informed is throughout the document in every sense. But I specifically took out recommendation in 9.2. Undertake training and education of all staff and officers so that they understand and implement culturally appropriate and trauma-informed practices, especially when dealing with the families of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and LGBTQS plus people. This was specific to police. I think it's extremely important to note that these are individuals that are impacted by trauma. This study is very, very clear on that. And it's not that we need the police to leave or go away, it's we need the police to be different. A lot of research, a lot of people find the findings when you're looking at marginalized communities that the police need to be there. We just need to be there differently. A considerable number of men and women in federal and provincial remands suggest prison can be a site of temporary refuge from otherwise challenging and dangerous, unhealthy, and intolerable conditions. In essence, prisons are better than the current alternatives. This finding does not mean more prison. Please don't take that. This finding means we need trauma-informed justice, not just from the police, but from corrections, from the defense bar, from the Crown, and from judges. We need to have an understanding of the impact that trauma has on individuals and how things like adverse childhood experiences can change the brain chemistry and provide what we would call a psychological injury that changes an individual's ability to heal, react differently, and we need to address those things in a way that's healthy and safe. Trauma-informed healthcare. Individuals walking into a healthcare situation and having an expectation that they are on drugs or on alcohol because of the color of their skin cannot happen anymore. People need to feel safe where they go and whenever they interact with systems. We need to look at the concept of decolonizing all of our systems. And how do we do that? If I had the answer for that, I wish I could tell you, but I truly believe that being trauma-informed and looking at things differently and interacting with populations differently is a start. Trauma-informed education. When we look at people's interaction and how they experience their education, it is a significant part of their lives. It is one of those places where people do feel bias and racism. In Dr. Sandra Basarius and Heather Thompson's research, they found that the Somali diaspora in Edmonton felt 85% of them felt that they had racism and bias treatment from school teachers and other school staff. We need to be trauma-informed on all systems. And I think this is the recent events of the death of George Floyd, the shooting of Jacob Blake, the death in the hospital in Quebec. All of these places, all of these things, all of these events have moved us towards a place where we need to take systems and we need to look at trauma. We need to be trauma-informed and we need to work better for the people that we are supposed to be helping. And I'm going to use the word again, compassion from systems actors. We have to be compassionate. We have to realize that the moment that we're dealing with someone isn't the entirety of their story, that the moment that we're dealing with somebody isn't what they chose. It may not be at all what they wanted, and that these individuals that we are dealing with every single day have dreams and aspirations, and we just have to do our jobs, our parts, to help them heal and reach those places where they want to be, where they see themselves. What this truly is a backdrop of systemic institutional failings. We have a lack of stable housing. It's individuals who are continuously homeless in the city of Edmonton and other places oftentimes get over-criminalized, further marginalized, and we don't do anything to address the root cause. It's really symptomatic criminality, where an individual is either breaking into places to stay warm, which happens, stealing things to address issues surrounding substance use, lack of stable housing, places to live, places to be warm, results in multiple police contacts. Lack of personal security. In the presentation, we have an individual, and this was not a single time that someone talked about using drugs to stay safe. If people in our society have to use methamphetamines to stay awake so that they don't get sexually assaulted, what are we missing? What part of safety and security have we failed upon? What part of safety and security have we failed upon for individuals to try to ensure that they are able to at least survive in a way that they feel safe? When you think about the fear of victimization constantly in you and how that affects your cortisol levels, and you have this massive physical impact that happens, we need to do better. Lack of services to manage addictions. There's individuals, and I have solid conversations with individuals from supervised consumption services often. There are people that on a daily basis are asking, they don't want to do drugs anymore. They are unhappy with where their life's at. They are unsafe. They feel unsafe. They are worried about a poison drug supply. They have lost friends to overdoses. And they go to the treatment center, and they're in line behind 35 other people, and the treatment center accepts 3. That happens 3 days in a row, and then you lose the opportunity, and the person unfortunately slips back into behavior that's unhealthy and that they don't even want to participate in. But addictions are a struggle for people, and it's hard without proper supports. As our systems and as the police, when we're dealing with individuals who are experiencing substance use disorder, there needs to be a level of compassion. There needs to be a level of compassion when we see individuals who are suffering. I can tell you one of the hardest things I've ever seen in my life was it was a homicide trial, and the witness that I had to get to court the next day had an opioid dependency. And unfortunately, we had to pick her up, and this was all voluntary. She stayed in a hotel with us because she wanted to testify. It was a murder of an elderly woman. And for 2 days, we had to not obviously supply her with any drugs because we were the police. Watching someone detox from opioids without any proper supports was one of the most painful things I've ever seen anyone go through. And we need to realize that we need to meet people where they are, not expect people to meet us where we are. Oftentimes they talk about the golden rule, treat others as you want to be treated. I truly believe the platinum rule, treat others as they want to or need to be treated. And I think if we move that lens there, and if we move into a more compassionate way of doing things, we are going to see significant and more impactful change in systems. Lack of services to address mental health issues. There are individuals that are suffering from mental health issues, and I can think of examples from my policing career where people assume that the individual is having an erratic behavior because of drugs that they've taken. However, when that person goes into remand center and spends 3 to 5 weeks in isolation, those behaviors worsen. Oftentimes, people with mental health issues are not getting proper treatment, not getting proper diagnoses, and unfortunately are self-medicating with street drugs. This is a massive issue and something that we as systems actors need to advocate for. We need to advocate for human beings to be treated as human beings. We need to get rid of strategies that address housing, homelessness, poverty, methamphetamines, and we need to turn that into one human-centered strategy that addresses the complex needs of human beings that have experienced complex trauma, that have unfortunately, as a result, had multiple systems contacts, whether it be healthcare or policing, and those contacts have created this churn that continues and continues and continues, and we haven't changed the way we do things in a meaningful manner to change the experience for those people, to ensure that those folks get treated in a compassionate, human way. Difficulties obtaining medical care. We live in a country that has allegedly free medical care, and I know individuals who suffer greatly and have issues getting wound care for things like amputated toes as a result of the cold, and to the point where those amputated toes become gangrenous and the person has to be admitted to hospital with the potential of losing their leg at the knee. We need to be better. We need to do better for people, and we need to make people feel that they are worth it. We need to make people feel like the system isn't there to hold them back, but the people in the systems are there to lift them up. And that is it for me. So I'm just going to try to get out of my screen sharing.
All right. Thanks so much, Dan. Okay, so we're going to take questions for Dan in a second here. Let me see if I can. There. So before we do that though, I do want to just take a second to talk about a couple of things that are going on at the center and give Dan a chance to, grab a gulp of coffee, get his voice back a little bit. So I'm just going to, I lost my Zoom here. Yeah, I am just going to share a quick slide with you here. And if I can find it. All right, we'll go with that. All right. All right, so the first thing I just want to announce before we do questions for Dan is for everyone to be aware and just remember that in November, we have our first conference at the CCR, which is going to be online. So we'll have Zoom sessions for the panelists. Everything else will be streamed on our YouTube channel, and we'll be taking questions for the panelists on our YouTube channel. You can see it down there at the bottom of the slide, and you can find links to it on our social media, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and at our website. The schedule for the conference is up at the website as well. So canadiancriminology.com/conferences, and you can see the full schedule. It's a pretty star-studded lineup of speakers, and we have David Garland from New York University giving the keynote address. So more information will be coming, and we'll be putting out advertising on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram for each of the individual sessions, and trying to keep everybody abreast as best as we can of what is going on. But again, that's November 17th to 19th. The sessions are running 8 a.m. to 3:20 p.m. And it's really a fabulous lineup. So I would recommend everybody go and check it out. And if you're looking for us on social media, you can find us here. So Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Obviously, we're streaming right now on YouTube, and all of that, again, you can find linked on canadiancriminology.com. So I'll leave that up for a few seconds while we kind of get going on questions for Dan, and I'll take it down in a second. But if anybody has questions for Dan, feel free to just speak up. I've lost my chat box. This happens when I'm screen sharing. And if you are joining us on YouTube, feel free to type into the chat on YouTube. So I have to